On her 65th birthday, Loretta set the table for 8, and ate alone. That same night, her family was raising champagne on a Mediterranean cruise she was never told about. A week later, she held a DNA test that would shatter everything they thought was real. When Loretta turned 65, she set the table for 8. No one came. At the exact same hour she sat in her dining room staring at untouched plates. Her daughter-in-law was posting sunlit photos from a Mediterranean cruise. Champagne glasses raised, ocean behind them, captioned "Living Our Best Life." Everyone was there. Her son, her grandchildren, even her own sister. Everyone except her. And a week later, Loretta would hold a DNA test in her hand that would make that smiling daughter-in-law go completely pale. I've spent years listening to family stories. Not the polished versions people tell at reunions, but the quiet ones whispered after the dishes are done. The stories about being overlooked, being replaced, being erased without anyone ever saying the words out loud. What fascinates me most is this. Families rarely break apart in one dramatic explosion. They unravel in small, deniable moments. A missed call. A miscommunication. A dinner that somehow keeps getting rescheduled. And that's why Loretta's story unsettled me so deeply. Because what happened on her 65th birthday wasn't loud. It was silent. If you're new here, welcome to Empathetic Story. This is where we don't just tell family stories, we sit with them, we question them, and sometimes we let them change us. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe truth deserves light, take a moment to subscribe. It helps this channel grow and keeps these conversations going. Loretta spent 3 weeks planning that birthday dinner. 3 weeks choosing the menu her son Elliot loved as a child. 3 weeks pressing the navy blue dress with the tiny pearl buttons he once said made her look elegant. She polished the good china, wrote each place card in her careful handwriting. Elliot, Meadow, Tommy, Emma, Ruth, Carl. She set herself at the head of the table, not out of ego, but because that seat let her see every face at once. Mothers never really stop scanning the room for their children. By 6:30, the candles were already lit. By 7, the roast was losing heat. By 8, the silence was no longer hopeful. It was hollow. I tried to imagine her standing there, phone in hand, refreshing her messages. Calling Elliot. Straight to voicemail. Calling Meadow. The same. Calling her sister Ruth. The one person she trusted to always answer on the second ring. Nothing. We tell ourselves comforting lies in moments like that. Traffic must be bad. Something urgent came up. Maybe they're planning a surprise. But the body knows before the mind does. Loretta's chest tightened. Her hands shook. Something wasn't just wrong, it was deliberate. And then she made what she later called her mistake. She opened Facebook. At the top of her feed was a photo so bright it almost hurt to look at. Meadow in a flowing white sundress, glowing in golden sunlight. Elliot beside her, smiling in a way Loretta hadn't seen in months. Behind them, the endless blue of the Mediterranean Sea. The caption read, "So grateful for this amazing family getaway." Family getaway. The timestamp showed it had been posted less than an hour earlier. While Loretta was still standing in her dining room waiting. I've asked myself this question over and over. What hurts more, conflict or invisibility? At least conflict acknowledges your presence. Invisibility is colder. It's a quiet rewriting of the narrative where you simply do not exist. Loretta scrolled. Tommy building sandcastles. Emma clutching a melting scoop of gelato. Ruth and Carl laughing at what looked like a ship's bar. Everyone was there. Coordinated outfits. Sunset dinners. Toasts. It wasn't just that they had taken a trip. It was that they had taken it on her birthday. And no one had mentioned it. Her phone buzzed a few minutes later. A text from Elliot. "Sorry, Mom. Forgot to mention we'd be out of town this week. Meadow booked a surprise trip. Happy birthday though. Forgot to mention." As if a Mediterranean cruise is something you accidentally leave out in casual conversation. As if booking it on your mother's birthday is an oversight. This is where I want you to pause with me. Because this wasn't an explosion. There were no insults. No screaming. No dramatic confrontations. Just absence. Loretta walked to the kitchen, turned off the oven, wrapped the cake she'd spent all morning baking. She loaded the untouched plates back into the cabinet, each porcelain click echoing too loudly in the empty house. She later told someone that night was the first time in 65 years she felt truly erased. Not forgotten. Erased. But here's what keeps me thinking about this story. That birthday wasn't an isolated incident. It was the moment she finally noticed a pattern. A pattern that had been forming quietly for years. Tommy's 4th birthday party that mysteriously changed dates. Emma's first day of kindergarten that started earlier than she was told. Christmas dinner that became just immediate family. Except apparently she no longer qualified. How many times can miscommunication happen before it stops being accidental? That's the question that lingered in Loretta's house long after the candles burned out. And it's the question that would eventually lead a stranger to knock on her door. A stranger who knew her grandson's name. A stranger who carried an envelope that would unravel everything. But that part came later. That night, Loretta climbed the stairs in her navy dress and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere across the ocean, her family was clinking glasses at sunset. Somewhere inside her something was cracking. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the unmistakable sound of ice splitting under pressure. And if you've ever felt that crack inside your own chest, if you've ever wondered whether you were imagining things or slowly being written out of your own story, I want you to stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't just about a birthday. It was about truth. And the kind of truth that doesn't just break a family. If that birthday felt like a crack in the ice, what Loretta began to see in the days that followed was the entire frozen lake beneath it. There's something unsettling about the moment when memory stops comforting you and starts accusing you. Loretta didn't wake up the next morning furious. She woke up unsettled. That kind of unease that hums quietly under your ribs and won't let you look away. And as I've learned from listening to so many family stories, that's often how truth begins. Not with rage but with recognition. She lay in bed replaying the past 5 years, not as isolated disappointments but as a sequence. That's when the small incidents began lining up like puzzle pieces that suddenly fit too perfectly. Tommy's 4th birthday party. She had been so excited to watch him blow out his candles. Meadow had greeted her at the door with that polished, apologetic smile and said the party had been moved to the following day. Because of an emergency. Loretta had stood there confused, because she could hear children laughing inside. She had assumed it was her mistake. Maybe she'd misread a text. Maybe she'd misunderstood. Later, Elliot sounded genuinely confused when she mentioned the rescheduling. No, Mom, the party was today. Meadow must have mixed up the dates. Mixed up the dates. At the time Loretta swallowed it. She didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law who created tension over logistics. Then there was Emma's first day of kindergarten. Loretta had asked 3 times what time they were dropping her off. Super early, Meadow had said. Like 7 a.m. probably too much for you. The implication wasn't overt, but it was there. You're older now. You don't need the hassle. When Loretta showed up anyway at 8:15, camera in hand, the teacher casually mentioned Emma had arrived at the normal 8:30 start time. She had missed her granddaughter's nervous little wave at the classroom door. Again Loretta assumed confusion. But confusion, I've noticed, becomes suspicious when it always falls in one direction. Last Christmas, Meadow had called 2 days before dinner. Elliot was overwhelmed, she explained. Work stress. They needed to keep it small this year. Immediate family only. Loretta had spent Christmas alone, reheating leftovers and trying not to feel foolish. A week later, Ruth mentioned she'd seen photos online. 20 people gathered around a long table, neighbors and college friends, laughter and wrapping paper everywhere. Everyone except Loretta. When I hear stories like this, I always ask the same question. Who benefits from the misunderstanding? Because patterns don't form randomly. They're built. What makes this kind of manipulation so effective is that it hides inside plausible deniability. No one says, we don't want you there. Instead, plans shift. Times change. Invitations get lost in translation. It creates just enough doubt that the excluded person begins questioning their own perception. And that's exactly what happened. Loretta began to second-guess herself. Maybe she was becoming forgetful. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe this was just what happens when children grow up and start their own lives. Meadow never attacked her directly. She didn't need to. She worked in the space between words. Your mom seems tired lately. I saw her at the grocery store. She looked a little confused. Maybe we shouldn't burden her with the kids this weekend. On the surface, those statements sound considerate. Underneath, they reframe a woman from capable to fragile, from essential to optional. I want you to think about how subtle that shift is. No raised voices. No dramatic ultimatums. Just the quiet planting of doubt. And Elliot, by all accounts a trusting man, absorbed it gradually. The Sunday dinners that used to happen every other week became monthly, then quarterly. Phone calls shortened. Conversations grew more surface level. He wasn't cruel. He was simply being redirected. Isolation rarely feels like exile at first. Feels like scheduling. Loretta started scrolling through Meadow's social media with new eyes. Photos of school plays she'd been told were canceled. Dance recitals described as just practice. Family barbecues she had never heard about. Every image carried captions about gratitude and togetherness. It wasn't just that she wasn't invited. It was that the visual narrative of the family functioned seamlessly without her. That's what struck me hardest when I first heard this story. The role of visibility. In the age of social media, presence is proof of belonging. When you stop appearing in the frame, you start disappearing from memory. Loretta began noticing something else too. The way Meadow lingered during hugs just a second too long, as if comforting someone fragile. The way she redirected the children's attention mid-conversation. Grandma Loretta's had a long day. Let Daddy show you your new toy. Small interruptions that gently trained the children's instincts away from her. By the time Loretta recognized the pattern, she realized it wasn't accidental. It was systematic. And here's where I want to be clear. This isn't about villainizing a daughter-in-law. It's about understanding control. True control doesn't shout. It rearranges the environment so that resistance looks unreasonable. If Loretta complained, she risked sounding paranoid. If she stayed silent, the erasure continued. That's the psychological trap. The birthday wasn't the beginning of her exclusion. It was the moment the illusion collapsed. As the days passed after that empty dinner table, Loretta felt something shift inside her. Not just hurt, clarity. For the first time she stopped asking, "Did I misunderstand?" and started asking, "Why does every misunderstanding remove me?" That question is powerful. It's the kind of question that disrupts manipulation because it changes the focus from isolated incidents to systemic design. And once you see a system, you can't unsee it. Loretta didn't yet know that a stranger would soon confirm her suspicions in ways she never imagined. But by the time that knock came at her door, she was no longer the confused woman staring at Crew's photos. She was a woman who had begun to recognize that being erased is not an accident. It is a strategy. And just as Loretta began to understand that her erasure was intentional, someone else knocked on her door with proof that the story was even bigger than she feared. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that feels suspended between exhaustion and clarity. Loretta was still in her robe, coffee growing cold in her hands when the doorbell rang. She almost didn't answer. After weeks of emotional whiplash, she wasn't eager for another surprise. But something in the persistence of that ring, steady not aggressive, made her look through the peephole. A man stood on her porch, mid-40s maybe, dark hair slightly disheveled as if he hadn't slept much. His posture wasn't confrontational. It was hesitant, like someone gathering courage to step into a conversation that could change everything. When she cracked the door, keeping the chain latched, he spoke carefully. "Mrs. Patterson? Loretta Patterson? Elliot's mother." There's something chilling about hearing your son's name from a stranger's mouth. Pulls you instantly into alertness. Loretta didn't invite him in immediately. She asked who he was. "My name is David Chan," he said. "I need to talk to you about Meadow." Now, if you've been following this story with me, you can imagine the tension in that moment. Meadow's name was already carrying weight inside Loretta's mind. But what David said next shifted the ground entirely. "I think my son might be living in your son's house." There are sentences that feel impossible at first hearing. This was one of them. David explained slowly, almost apologetically, as if he understood how unbelievable it sounded. Years ago, before Meadow met Elliot, she had been in a serious relationship with him. They had lived together. They had talked about marriage. Then she became pregnant. He described the joy he felt at the time, the plans he had started making, and then just as suddenly she disappeared. No argument. No dramaticudie. She left while he was at work, taking her belongings, erasing herself from his life so completely it felt surgical. He searched, filed reports, hired an investigator. Nothing. Until 3 months ago. He had been attending a conference in Sacramento when he saw her on the street. Meadow. Only now she looked settled. Married. A little boy walking beside her who stopped him mid-step. Because the child looked like him. Not vaguely. Not coincidentally. Unmistakably. Same dark eyes. Same jawline. Same slight gap between the front teeth. Even the same way of tilting his head when concentrating. I've heard many family stories over the years, but there's something particularly haunting about the idea of recognizing your child in a crowd, without ever having met them. David followed at a distance that day, not to confront her, but to confirm what his instincts were screaming. And then he did something that tells you he wasn't reckless. He didn't storm into Elliot's house. He didn't create a scene. He hired a second investigator, a more thorough one. Someone who could trace records, timelines, legal documents. That's when he learned Meadow's legal name wasn't Meadow Martinez. It was Margaret Winters. And that wasn't the only thing she had changed. But before he shared any of that, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A manila envelope. He didn't push it toward Loretta immediately. He just held it like someone holding fragile glass. I got a DNA test, he said. I was able to obtain a sample of Tommy's hair. I tested it against my own. Now pause with me here. This is the moment when a story stops being emotional and starts becoming evidentiary. Up until now, Loretta had been dealing with patterns and instincts. David was bringing numbers, probabilities, science. He told her the results had come in the day before. He hadn't opened the envelope with her yet, but he knew what it said. There's something important about the fact that he came to Loretta first. He could have gone directly to court. He could have confronted Elliot. Instead, he said something that I find deeply revealing. I saw the cruise photos, he admitted. I looked through Meadow's social media. You weren't in any of them. Felt like she was removing you. The same way she removed me. That's the thread that connects them. Not just a child. A pattern. David described how, toward the end of their relationship years ago, Meadow had slowly isolated him. Subtly reframing his friends as negative influences. Suggesting his family didn't understand them. Encouraging him to rely only on her. When he started asking questions about timelines during her pregnancy, tension grew. And then she vanished. Isolation first. Questions second. Disappearance third. Loretta listened, and for the first time, her experiences were mirrored back to her by someone outside the family. That's a powerful thing. When manipulation is happening, victims often feel alone in their perception. Validation breaks that isolation. David leaned forward slightly and said something that changed the emotional tone of the entire conversation. I don't want to take Tommy away from the father he knows, he said. But I can't stand by if he's being used as part of a larger lie. That sentence tells you everything about his motivation. This wasn't revenge. It was protection. Loretta looked at the envelope in her hands. The weight of it felt disproportionate to the paper inside. Because what was inside wasn't just biology. It was a collapse. If Tommy wasn't Elliot's biological son, then the foundation of that marriage had been built on deception. And if deception was that deep, what else was unstable? Before she opened it, David asked her gently, Are you ready to know? I think that question matters. Because sometimes truth doesn't just expose someone else. It redefines your entire role in your own life. Loretta thought about her grandson's laughter. About the gradual distancing. About the cruise photos. About every miscommunication that now looked engineered. Then she opened the envelope. And the numbers inside didn't whisper. They declared. The numbers inside the envelope didn't whisper. They stripped away illusion with clinical precision. 99.7% probability of paternity. I've always found it striking how cold scientific language can be. There's no emotion in it. No hesitation. No room for reinterpretation. Just probability, percentage, conclusion. And yet those sterile numbers can detonate entire worlds. For Loretta, that single sheet of paper did more than confirm a suspicion. It reframed 7 years of her son's life. Tommy was not Elliot's biological child. Let me be clear about something here because this matters. Biology does not define love. Elliot had raised that boy. He had taught him to ride a bike, read bedtime stories, sat through school recitals. That bond was real. But the foundation beneath it, the premise on which the marriage had been built, was not. And when foundations are fabricated, everything above them shifts. As Loretta read the report again, her mind wasn't only on the DNA. It moved to timelines, to dates she suddenly remembered with uncomfortable clarity. Tommy had been born 3 weeks early. At the time, everyone accepted that explanation without question. Doctors reassured them. Elliot worried but trusted. Meadow comforted. It all felt plausible. But when you lay David's timeline over Elliot's, the math becomes uncomfortably exact. Tommy hadn't been premature. He had been perfectly on time. That's when David unfolded the second layer of truth. Meadow Martinez was not her legal name. It was Margaret Winters. She had changed it before marrying Elliot. And this wasn't her first reinvention. Records showed 2 previous marriages in different states, both ending within a few years, both involving financial settlements. The pattern wasn't chaotic. It was consistent. Meet a stable man. Move quickly. Secure commitment. Isolate him from external anchors. Exit when control weakens. I want you to pause with me here, because it's tempting to simplify this into villain and victim. But what unsettles me most is not the deception itself. It's the architecture of it. Manipulation at this scale requires planning. It requires emotional intelligence weaponized into strategy. Isolation is never the final move. It is the prerequisite. Loretta began to see the previous 5 years not as random emotional injuries but as structural engineering. If she remained present in Elliot's life, she represented continuity. She knew when the relationship began. She remembered dates. She would have been the one most likely to question inconsistencies. A mother is often the archive of a family's memory, and archives threaten fabricated narratives. That realization hit Loretta in a way that was almost chilling. The birthday exclusion wasn't about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was about reducing her credibility. If she appeared forgetful, emotional, overly sensitive, then any future doubt she expressed could be dismissed as paranoia. I've seen this dynamic before in other stories. Discredit the observer before the observer notices. David also uncovered something else that deserves attention. Emma, born 2 years after Tommy, was biologically Elliot's. And on the surface that might seem reassuring. But from a psychological perspective it's strategic. If a woman who entered a relationship pregnant later gives her husband a biological child, suspicion decreases dramatically. It stabilizes the narrative. It cements emotional loyalty. One real bond conceals another deception. When Loretta considered that possibility, she felt a wave of nausea. Not because Emma was any less loved but because the timing of her birth now appeared potentially calculated. A safeguard against doubt. I want to be careful here. We cannot know every internal motive, but we can examine patterns. And the pattern in front of them was undeniable. David didn't present himself as a hero. He was careful with his words. He said repeatedly that he did not want to rip Tommy away from the only father he had ever known. What he wanted was transparency, shared responsibility, protection from continued manipulation. That distinction matters. Because this story could have turned into a custody battle fueled by ego. Instead, it became a question of truth and agency. Who deserves to know their identity? Who deserves to make informed choices about their own family? Loretta sat in her living room holding documents that exposed not just infidelity, but identity fraud. The name changes. The interstate marriages. The disappearing acts. The consistency of isolation preceding each departure. And here is where my own reflection deepens. When someone rewrites their name, their past, their timeline, they are not merely hiding mistakes. They are constructing an alternate reality. And anyone who threatens that construction must be removed from the frame. That includes former partners. And it includes mothers-in-law. For the first time since that empty birthday table, Loretta felt something stronger than grief. She felt clarity etched with resolve. She had been trying to interpret emotional signals. Now she had evidence. Evidence transforms doubt into responsibility. Because once you know the truth, inaction becomes participation. The hardest part wasn't the revelation itself. It was anticipating what it would do to Elliot. To realize that your marriage began under false pretenses is not just embarrassing. It's destabilizing. It forces you to question your own judgment, your own memory, your own reality. And yet, withholding the truth would mean allowing the structure to remain intact. David asked her what she wanted to do next. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at Tommy's framed school picture on the side table. The child hadn't asked for any of this. He was not a pawn. He was a boy who deserved honesty handled carefully. That's when Loretta understood something critical. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. The truth had been uncovered in a quiet living room on a Tuesday morning. But truth, once exposed, demands confrontation. And that confrontation would not happen in anger. It would happen at a dinner table. And so the truth, once uncovered, waited patiently for its moment at the table. Loretta chose a Saturday evening. Not out of drama but out of intention. Weekends meant the children would be relaxed, Elliot wouldn't be rushing from work, and there would be no convenient excuse to cut the night short. She called her son with a calmness that surprised even her. She asked for dinner. She said she had something important to discuss about the future of the family. I've thought a lot about that choice. When you've been slowly erased, it's tempting to confront in anger. But anger gives manipulators leverage. Calm removes it. Loretta didn't want a scene. She wanted clarity. They arrived right on time. Meadow stepped inside first, composed as ever, wearing a soft cream dress that suggested innocence. Elliot followed, looking tired in a way that had become familiar. New lines around his eyes, a weight of quiet strain in his posture. Tommy rushed in with the energy of a child who still believed the world was steady. Emma trailed behind, clutching her doll. There is something almost unbearable about children laughing in a room where adults are about to detonate the truth. Loretta served Elliot's favorite meal. She made sure the atmosphere felt normal. Not tense. Not dramatic. I find that detail important. She wasn't trying to ambush them. She was trying to ensure that when the truth landed, it wouldn't be dismissed as emotional volatility. During dinner, Meadow performed effortlessly. She cut Tommy's food, reminded Emma to use her napkin, touched Elliot's arm when he mentioned work stress. If you didn't know what was coming, you would see nothing but a devoted wife. But Loretta watched differently now. She noticed how Meadow subtly redirected conversation whenever it drifted toward family history. How she gently interrupted when Tommy mentioned missing Grandma during the cruise. Control didn't always look harsh. Sometimes it looked like guidance. When the children finished eating, Loretta suggested they play in the living room. Meadow hesitated. I want you to notice that hesitation. It wasn't loud. It was a flicker. An instinct sensing that the script might shift. Once the children were out of earshot, Loretta returned to the dining table where the manila folder rested beside her coffee cup. The weight of it felt different now. Not threatening. Grounding. Elliot reached for Meadow's hand. What did you want? To talk about, Mom. There are moments in life when your voice either trembles or steadies. Loretta steadied. I want to talk about honesty, she said. About what it means to build a family on truth. Meadow's smile tightened. That sounds a little serious for dinner. It is, Loretta replied, and she opened the folder. I imagine the silence in that room felt dense. Paper sliding across wood. Elliot's eyes scanning unfamiliar words. DNA. Probability. Paternity. What is this? He asked, confusion shifting to disbelief as he read further. It's a paternity test, Loretta said carefully. For Tommy. That sentence alone would fracture any room. Elliot's face drained of color. Meadow stood abruptly, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. This is insane, she said. I don't know what kind of manipulation this is, but... Margaret, Loretta interrupted. The name landed like a dropped glass. I've replayed that moment in my mind. There is power in calling someone by the identity they tried to bury. It removes disguise. It demands alignment between past and present. Elliot looked from his mother to his wife, confusion now edged with something else, fear. Loretta laid out the documents with deliberate care. The legal name. The previous marriages. The timelines. The report confirming a 99.7% probability that David Chun was Tommy's biological father. I want to slow down here because this is not just revelation, it's collapse. Elliot wasn't just confronting infidelity. He was confronting the possibility that his entire marriage began under false pretenses. "Tell me this isn't real," he whispered. Meadows' composure, so carefully maintained for years, began to crack. She shifted from denial to deflection, from deflection to accusation. She suggested Loretta was unstable, that David was a stalker, that this was a conspiracy. But facts do something emotion cannot. They hold. Elliot read the report again. His hand trembled slightly. He wasn't angry at first. He was disoriented. That's what truth does when it disrupts a constructed reality. It leaves you momentarily without footing. "Tommy is my son," he said finally, voice breaking. "I raised him. And you always will be his father," Loretta answered softly. "That doesn't change. But he also deserves to know where he comes from. And you deserve to know the truth." Notice the distinction. She didn't attack Meadows' character. She focused on truth and agency. Meadows' silence in that moment was louder than her protests. When Elliot asked her directly whether any of it was real, whether she had ever truly loved him, she did not answer. And sometimes the absence of denial is confirmation. From the living room, the children's laughter drifted in. It cut through the tension like a reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't about winning. It was about protecting. Elliot covered his face with his hands. I don't think he cried out of humiliation. I think he cried because trust, once broken, rearranges your understanding of yourself. You begin questioning not just the other person but your own judgment. Meadow moved toward the door without another word. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply left, her carefully curated identity unraveling behind her. As the door closed, Loretta didn't feel triumphant. That's important. There was no victory in her expression. Only gravity. The confrontation had done what it needed to do. It exposed what had been hidden. It shifted control away from secrecy and toward transparency. But exposure is only the beginning. What happens after truth enters a room determines whether a family disintegrates or rebuilds. What happened after that door closed was not dramatic or cinematic. It was slow, uncomfortable, and profoundly human. Truth does not magically repair what deception has damaged. It destabilizes first. Elliot did not wake up the next morning empowered. He woke up grieving. Grieving the marriage he thought he had, the narrative he believed in, and the version of himself who had trusted without question. I've always believed that betrayal isn't just about what someone else did. It's about the identity you built around that person. When that collapses, you feel like you collapse with it. In the weeks that followed, the house Elliot once shared with Meadow felt unfamiliar to him. Rooms carry memory, and memory had to be reinterpreted. Conversations replayed differently in his mind. Moments that once seemed affectionate now looked strategic. The realization was exhausting. But here's what struck me most about this part of the story. No one rushed to replace chaos with perfection. They chose process. David did not storm in claiming territory. He didn't try to assert dominance or demand immediate custody. Instead, he requested structured mediation, therapy, legal clarity, gradual integration. That restraint told me something important about his character. He understood that protecting a child requires patience, not ego. Tommy's world shifted quietly. Children sense tension long before adults articulate it. He asked questions. Why was Mommy gone? Why did Daddy look sad? Why was there another man talking gently in the kitchen? The adults didn't overwhelm him with details. They focused on reassurance. You are loved. That hasn't changed. I think we underestimate children's capacity to adapt when truth is handled with care. Tommy eventually began referring to Elliot as Dad and David as Daddy Dave. It wasn't forced. It emerged naturally, the way children integrate complexity without overanalyzing it. He didn't experience it as betrayal. He experienced it as expansion. Emma, younger and more sensitive, struggled differently. Her sense of stability had been tied to routine. Therapy helped her process confusion without internalizing blame. I want to emphasize this because it matters. Professional support was not treated as weakness. It was treated as responsibility. That decision alone probably prevented years of silent damage. 6 months later, the energy in Loretta's house felt different. Not louder, lighter. Sunday dinners returned, but without performance. There was no need to curate appearances. Conversations were slower, more honest. Elliot admitted openly that he regretted not questioning sooner. David acknowledged the fear he carried about overstepping. Loretta herself spoke about how close she had come to doubting her own instincts. That kind of dialogue doesn't happen automatically. It happens because people commit to humility. Meadow eventually relinquished custody rights as part of a legal agreement that avoided further public conflict. She left quietly, repeating a pattern from her past. I don't recount that with satisfaction. There is something deeply tragic about a person who reinvents themselves so often that authenticity becomes foreign. But accountability is not cruelty. It is consequence. The most remarkable transformation wasn't legal. It was relational. Elliot slowly rebuilt friendships he had allowed to fade. He reconnected with colleagues. He began to separate his identity from the relationship that had once defined him. Watching him regain emotional footing must have been both painful and healing for Loretta. A mother witnessing her adult child confront vulnerability is a different kind of heartbreak. David found his place carefully. He moved nearby, not into the center. He asked before assuming. He learned the family's traditions instead of replacing them. One evening he made a gesture that moved me deeply when I first heard it. He asked if he could add Patterson to his own last name so that Tommy would feel connected to both sides without erasing history. That's not a legal requirement. That's intentional inclusion. I want to pause here and reflect on something broader. Families are often described as either intact or broken, as if those are the only two states. But Loretta's story challenges that binary. What she ended up with wasn't the family she originally imagined when Elliot first married. It was not conventional, but it was transparent. Transparency is stability. The laughter that returned to her kitchen 6 months later sounded different. Not because it was louder, but because it wasn't fragile. There were no undercurrents of control. No need to manage perception. When Tommy burst through the door shouting about soccer practice, he did so without glancing over his shoulder for approval. That detail matters. Children who feel safe move freely. Elliot once admitted to his mother that he would always regret not seeing the truth earlier. She responded with something I think we all need to hear sometimes. Trusting someone is not a flaw. Deception belongs to the deceiver, not the one who believed. That distinction released him from shame. As I reflect on this part of the journey, what stays with me isn't the exposure of lies. It's the quiet discipline of rebuilding. It's easier to expose than to repair. Repair requires sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and the willingness to redefine roles without clinging to pride. Loretta's 65th birthday had once felt like the end of her relevance. 6 months later she was more central than ever. Not because she demanded power, but because she stood for truth without cruelty. There's a difference between dismantling a false structure and destroying a family. They dismantled the lie. And in doing so, they made room for something more resilient than what had existed before. And when the noise of crisis finally settled into the rhythm of ordinary Sundays, what remained was not just a repaired family, but a lesson that refuses to leave me. I've told you this story not because it is dramatic, but because it is revealing. Loretta's 65th birthday could have been reduced to a sad anecdote about being forgotten. Instead, it exposed something far more complex. Emotional erasure as a strategy. That's what keeps echoing in my mind. Not the cruise. Not even the DNA test. But the slow, calculated removal of a person from their own narrative. If you've been listening closely, you've probably realized this story was never only about Meadow. It was about perception. About how easily doubt can be planted. About how often we dismiss our own instincts in order to preserve harmony. Loretta almost convinced herself she was being overly sensitive. She almost accepted invisibility as a natural part of aging. And that is the part that unsettles me the most. Because erasure does not begin with cruelty. It begins with suggestion. She seems tired lately. Maybe she doesn't need to come. It might be too much for her. The language sounds protective. The impact is isolating. What Loretta did differently, what shifted everything, was not exposing someone else's lie. It was refusing to accept her own disappearance. That distinction matters. Truth did not empower her because it humiliated another person. It empowered her because it restored alignment between what she sensed and what she knew. I think about that often. How many of us have experienced moments when something felt wrong, but we chose silence because confrontation seemed disruptive? How many times have we labeled our intuition as paranoia simply because the alternative required courage? Family dynamics are complicated. They are layered with history, obligation, affection, and fear. That's why manipulation inside families is particularly dangerous. It hides inside loyalty. It uses love as leverage. And when you challenge it, you risk being seen as the aggressor. Loretta understood that risk. She did not confront from rage. She confronted from clarity. There's a profound difference between those two states. Rage seeks punishment. Clarity seeks restoration. And restoration does not always mean returning to what was. In this case, it meant building something new. A structure not based on secrecy but on shared truth. A structure where children are not pawns in adult power struggles. Where fathers can coexist without competition. Where a grandmother can sit at the table without questioning whether she belongs. What strikes me most deeply is this. The family that emerged was not simpler. It was more complex. 2 fathers. Therapy sessions. Legal adjustments. Hard conversations. But complexity is not dysfunction. Dishonesty is. I've come to believe that real families are not defined by biology or tradition alone. They are defined by accountability. By the willingness to say, I was wrong. By the courage to protect children from adult ego. By the humility to admit when trust has been misplaced. Loretta once thought her 65th birthday marked the end of her relevance. Instead, it marked the beginning of her agency. That shift is powerful. Relevance is not granted by others. It is claimed through integrity. And perhaps the most surprising part of this entire journey is that the story did not end in bitterness. There was no celebration of someone else's downfall. There was no public humiliation. There was simply consequence followed by rebuilding. I don't feel satisfaction when I think about Meadow leaving. I feel a quiet sadness. Because reinvention without accountability always ends the same way, isolated. Control cannot sustain intimacy, can only simulate it. But I do feel something else when I picture those Sunday dinners 6 months later. I feel steadiness. Children laughing without hesitation. Adults speaking without fear of misinterpretation. A house that no longer feels like a stage set for appearances. If you've ever felt like you were being written out of your own family's story, I want you to sit with that feeling. Not to inflame it. Not to weaponize it. But to examine it. Ask yourself whether the confusion you've been carrying might actually be clarity waiting to be acknowledged. And if you were in Loretta's place, if you discovered that your exclusion was intentional, that your instincts were accurate, that truth could unravel everything, what would you do? Would you protect peace at the expense of honesty? Or would you risk discomfort to restore alignment? Have you ever experienced a moment when a single revelation forced you to reevaluate years of your life?
I'm genuinely curious.
Stories like this only matter if they open conversations beyond the screen. So tell me, what would you have done? And if you're watching from somewhere far away, let me know where. It reminds me that these stories travel further than the walls of one house. On the final screen, I've left 2 more stories that explore family, truth, and the fragile balance between love and control. If this one stayed with you, I think those will too. Thank you for staying until the end. When I step back and look at Loretta's story as a whole, what stays with me isn't the cruise, or even the DNA results. It's the quiet moment when she realized she had almost accepted being erased. That's the real turning point. The birthday wasn't just a missed dinner. It was a mirror. It forced her to confront a painful truth. Sometimes the greatest harm in a family isn't loud conflict but silent exclusion. And yet, instead of collapsing under that realization, she chose clarity over comfort. She chose truth over fragile peace. And in doing so, she didn't destroy her family. She gave it a chance to rebuild on something real. The confrontation was painful. The aftermath was complicated. But what emerged was more honest, more stable, and more protective of the children involved. Loretta didn't fight to win. She fought to restore alignment between what she felt and what was actually happening. That distinction is powerful. It reminds us that defending your place in your own story is not selfish. It is necessary. The deeper lesson here is this. If you consistently feel excluded, dismissed, or subtly minimized, don't ignore that pattern. Patterns matter more than isolated incidents. Pay attention to repeated behaviors, not just single events. And if something feels wrong, pause and ask yourself whether you are protecting harmony at the cost of truth. In real life, this might mean having difficult conversations earlier, setting boundaries with calm firmness, documenting facts instead of reacting emotionally, and seeking outside perspective, whether from trusted friends or professionals, before doubt turns into self-blame. Protecting your dignity does not require aggression. It requires clarity and courage. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you were in Loretta's place, would you have confronted the truth, or stayed silent to avoid breaking the family apart? Please share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, so we can learn from each other's perspectives. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep meaningful conversations like this going. It rebuilds it.